Support for Lab Out Loud is brought to you by the National Science Teachers Association. Find out more at nsta.org. You're listening to the Lab Out Loud podcast, Science for the Classroom and Beyond. And today we're looking at what happens when we let science run its course as we watch different art projects.
It definitely draws on the way that nature is always changing, and that's why the outdoors is such a powerful teacher for children, is because there is a lot to watch and experience in how those systems connect and what's happening. And really, I think it's for teachers, stepping outside and looking at what's around you, and then, again, thinking about how that might change under different conditions, or what you might add that would allow children to observe those changes that they can manipulate and play with.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud. But first, I'm your co-host, Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel. Yeah, Dale, we've had a lot of guests on the show talking about art, even in science, and we've even talked at all levels.
Yeah, you're right. I think the art and science connection is something that I always kind of watch for, or I guess it catches my eye. So I did catch this one on an NSTA blog, and it was about ephemeral art. And I thought, oh, this looks interesting. And guess that's how a lot of podcasts happen. It's just me wanting to know more. So I started a podcast so I could learn more.
That's a good way of looking at 12 years now. I know exactly why you want to do this. This is selfish, Dale.
Yes. And it's not ephemeral, I hope. We can keep them in.
Ooh.
Yeah.
I see where you go. I see where you went with that.
Yes.
Yeah. So with us to talk about the project, we have Peggy Ashbrook.
Hi, I'm Peggy Ashbrook.
And some of you might already know Peggy. She is an early childhood science educator. She sometimes writes for NSTA in Science and Children and in the Early Years blog. And with her is Sandra Redmore.
Hi, I'm Sandra Redmore.
Sandra is the director of the Clarendon Childcare Center in Arlington. So we're happy to have Peggy and Sandra here. And we first wanted to know, well, what is ephemeral art?
Ephemeral art could be described as any kind of art which is brief or fleeting. It's not something that is permanent. It's a temporary art, and it's often made from nature objects, things that may be found outdoors and used by artists, young and old, to create something that's important to them. And it could be something that's documented using photography or videos, such as the well-known artist Andy Goldsworthy.
Do you have any examples of what that might look like?
Sure. There's a wonderful artist, Nora Naranjo Morse, who has done a sculpture outside of the National Museum of the American Indian in Washington, D.C., and it's called Always Becoming. You could see that online. And it has a series of shapes, sculptures that have been built and then allowed to be reformed over time through nature, through weather events and the natural weathering that happens.
I see. And so you have brought this to the early childhood level as a way to introduce science also, or make a connection with science. Am I describing that correctly?
Yeah. You see young children making things all the time. They pick up a stick and it becomes this or that. And they find ways to incorporate leaves, say, in their play. They might make a plate and then cut up leaves or tear them up and shape them into pieces of food and pretend to serve food. So I wanted to bring the idea of creating art pieces to young children in the program this summer, and to support the teachers in thinking about having children create art outdoors.
So now these are students who may not have a lot of background in art. What makes it art versus just imaginative play?
Yeah, it's a good question, and something that I was discussing with the teachers. And so it's not, I wouldn't say there's one answer for that. I think these children do have a lot of experience with art. They do create in many different ways, and Sandra can tell you more about that. But outdoors, they haven't done as much creating with the natural materials on a regular basis. They do, of course, sometimes. And so it's interesting. One teacher said that she saw the children creating art when they were making what they called stews or soup, and they would add water, sand, mud, leaves, flowers, and stir it up, and it makes a beautiful color and interesting shapes in the water. And I'm not quite sure that I would call that art. I want to see some intentionality. It's something that they're creating something on purpose to represent something or represent a feeling, or something that maybe they recognize later, like, oh, it looks like, it looks like a rainbow. They might come up with that later. So I don't know that there's one answer to that about if it's art or not.
It's an interesting question. What is art and what is science? And then looking at what sorts of behaviors both artists and scientists show, and then young children. First of all, just to correct the record, I think the children and teachers do engage in a lot of outdoor art. They paint with mud. They build and create patterns with rocks. But
sidewalk chalk comes to mind.
Yeah. And in our program, we really honor and give children the time and freedom to explore outdoors. Many children don't have that opportunity in school or at home with just the highly structured nature of school, and often the way that they spend their times. They're not running free through their backyard in the woods in the way that perhaps 20, 30 years ago was more common. But when you leave children to their own devices in nature, I think you will see them picking leaves and looking at the patterns and arranging them and stacking the rocks. And again, thinking about that intersection between art and science, I think about the way that both as a scientist and as an artist, you observe closely. You need to have good questions. Think about that word intentionality you were using, Peggy. But I'm not sure that when a child comes to an experience and doesn't have an end point in mind when they approach it, or a distinct conclusion when they're done, that means it's not art. I think about some very famous artists and their very different creative processes, and I'm not sure that Jackson Pollock approaching his canvas is, not living in that moment of experiencing how the paint moves and flicks and feeling that in a way that a young child does as they are stirring that mud and dropping the petals in. But I think for both the science and the art, there is that piece of reflecting and watching, and then having good questions and seeing where it goes over time. And that's one of the things that's interesting and powerful about ephemeral art and the experiences the teachers and children had on the playground with Peggy this summer, is that opportunity to watch things change over time, both as they manipulated it, but as the elements and nature took over, and to see what happened day after day.
And it was beautiful to watch the children who maybe didn't initially want to get their hands in the mud or in the clay, approach it very carefully, and then little by little become more involved and end up with their hands all over it, and really understanding the nature of clay by feeling it and seeing how they could manipulate it and see what happened when water changed it or when it got dried out. So that process of children becoming engaged with the materials was just wonderful to see.
What were their ages?
And the children at our center, the youngest children are 2.5 when they join us. This was in the summertime, so most of them were about 3.5 on the younger end of the age range, all the way up until just before they head to kindergarten. So the oldest were about 5.5.
So do you feel like this is like the perfect moment in time? Would older kids respond as well to this? Or are they too jaded by the outdoors and art?
Well, I think that's the beauty of the outdoors, right? I mean, I think it really invites children and adults, all ages, to experience, to explore, to play, to take risks. So absolutely. I mean, you think about what happens when you let kids of any age loose near a creek, right? I mean, I can think of myself having some glorious summers building dams and splashing and throwing rocks. And I mean, I think that's very natural behavior for all of us.
I know a safety guy in our district, though, that would not like that. So
there's ways. There's ways to do it very safely. And
good,
I've seen in a small city park near where I live, middle schoolers finding downed branches and dragging logs together and making, I guess they might be thinking of it as some kind of a house structure, but piling branches together. So it isn't something that is just for the very young.
So
no, and in fact,
go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think one of the things actually I find right now really important and compelling is the fact that older children really need to have those opportunities to have their hands in the dirt and on rocks, on sticks, because you really can't understand fully the properties of matter without hands-on experience and eyes-on observations and out in the world. And again, I think life is very different in the early years and through the elementary school years than it was 20, 30 years ago. For many children, they're simply not having those rich experiences. And certainly children who may have more limited opportunities due to either safety or just their being, in a very urban environment, to have those experiences. I think it's really important as educators, even of older children, that we are giving them that time to help them really develop and understand.
Is that a gut feeling that they're not having those experiences, or is it something that's been measured? Or
it is something actually that's really been studied, and I think the most famous and sort of seminal piece of work is Richard Louve's book, Last Child in the Woods. That focuses most specifically on the aspect of the impact on children's behavior and the rise of ADHD in relation to the time that children are not spending in nature. But yeah, there's a whole body of work about the importance of nature and in relation to children's growth and development and learning.
Now, in terms of science, is there a moment that it becomes science, or I don't want okay, time for the science portion now, but how do you make those connections?
Yeah, there's definitely not just one moment when it's science and one moment when it's art. It's an integrated process where children are experiencing the materials, whether it's paint, whether it's leaves, rocks, clay, sticks, even sunshine, light, and shadow. They're experiencing that and getting a baseline understanding, a very beginning understanding of how to manipulate those materials. And then understanding that that is a part of the natural phenomena, whether the paint is thick or thin, if the stick is easy to break or hard, depending on how thick it is. So it's not just a one time when it's science and one time when it's art. I think it's always a integration of both.
Sure. And we've talked on the show about the integration of art and science and how tightly knit those can actually be. So that's really amazing to see in such a young age.
Yeah,
and I think it's really wonderful.
Yeah, I think for me, working with teachers and other educators working with children, and part of what makes an experience with children move in a direction that is scientific, that you might call science, as opposed to just playing or art, is really observing the observation and helping children to observe about what they're doing, helping them to articulate those observations and to form questions based on those observations. That's a very scientific behavior. And then as children are ready, helping them to have an idea or a theory and test that out, and then to measure and document. So those are all things that, again, especially when you're talking about measuring and documenting, some of that is a little bit different than art, but in that same, whether it's seeing what happens with the leaf pinned up on the wall as the wind and the rain hits it, there are things that you can bring to that experience that really help children to learn to engage like a scientist as a scientist in
Sure.
that inquiry-based learning. Yeah.
And that's where I was going with my question is like, there has to be certainly some guidance from the teacher that's involved to get them into those areas of recording. I can't imagine kids would kind of record their results just on their own. And even if they did, they might need some guidance with that. And the other thing is that all artists, if they do those kinds of things, that's going to inform how they take on their next art project.
Replicate
yes, exactly.
their results.
That's part of that, the recording it in their mind. They're going to use those memories to make choices the next time. Programs like Clarendon, where they have access to materials and the teachers look for children's interests to allow them to use different materials and make choices for themselves. They're not dictated by the teachers to only do this or that. Those kinds of choices that the children make are based on their previous experiences and they're being informed by the understanding that they've gained of the natural phenomena, the thickness of the paint or the stickiness of the clay, whether they should add water to it or not. Those prior experiences really build their understanding of the materials.
It's funny because there's times where we talk on the show about maybe some activities or some kind of new technique that you might try, but you might need some special equipment or you might need to have, purchase something. But this seems to be like we could go outside and do that right now. So where would a person or a teacher that's interested in doing this right now, do you have suggestions on where to start, or is there like a gateway activity for science and ephemeral art?
I like the gateway activity.
Gateway art.
Yeah.
And I'm from St. Louis, so that's awesome.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah. No, I think Peggy,
I do
you were
love
going
for teachers to watch one of the videos of Andy Goldsworthy at work and to listen to him talk about his experience and his practice, and then to reflect on what their children do when they're outside, when they aren't being told to, stay away from those leaves or that dirt or that sand or those sticks because those are icky or nasty or dangerous. That let them use those materials and then observe how children are using them, and then build from there.
Mm-hmm. And as we're in Wisconsin, so we're starting to see the leaves turn, and I think that we could easily see connections into seasons, as snow's falling, things like that too. Do you see that taken into account as well?
Definitely.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was just going to say, yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the powerful things about ephemeral art is it definitely draws on the way that nature is always changing, and that's why the outdoors is such a powerful teacher for children, is because it is very dynamic, and so there is a lot to watch and experience in how those systems connect and what's happening. And so absolutely the changing seasons, and really I think it's for teachers, stepping outside and looking at what's around you, and then again, thinking about how that might change under different conditions, or what you might add that would allow children to observe those changes that they can manipulate and play with. Things that you can mix or manipulate or be manipulated by wind and rain and elements.
And building with snow is, a very classic example of something, making a sculpture, a fort, a snow angel, a snowman. All those sculptures that do change over time is just one form of ephemeral art.
Mm-hmm. As we had a late snowfall in April with almost 2 feet of snow, it was something that I was really happy to see go. But even that process of melting definitely has a piece there too.
Leaves all the till behind. That's my favorite.
Oh,
it leaves all the dirt and grime behind. I mean, I don't the dirt and grime behind, but it's always, to me,
the patterns,
like a little baby model of when the glacier melts and leaves glacier till behind. Sorry, I was a geology major. Sorry.
I grew up in Cleveland, and also I'm a geosciences major, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, all right. We'll talk after. So you did this refresh my memory. You did the project over the summer. Are there future plans?
Well, I know that the program continues to do all kinds of amazing art projects. Sandra, you want to talk about that?
Yeah, well, so first of all, the remains of one of the artworks created over the summer is still on the playground, and children are still interacting with it. There's a stump that they covered with burlap and used sticks and clay and stones and all kinds of things to create a shape that you may or may not call sculpture, depending on your point of view of what makes art art. But it is still there. A lot of the clay is cracking and is washed off, but is continuing to change, and it sort of comes and goes with how much children pay attention to it. So that is still there. And I would just throw out there, too, I think this is something that also is powerful to me about ephemeral art, is that you can leave something over a long period of time, and children watching that change over a very long period of time can give you a different kind of learning and experience, and letting children come in and out of that. I think in our very sound bite, online driven brains and lives now, we expect things and learning and experiences to start and stop within a very short period of time. And often as educators, we're not thinking about an activity lasting over months, but it actually is very powerful and in some ways in sync with the way that children learn, to let them come back to something and in and out of it over time, and to allow them that opportunity and that experience. So we'll see what happens with that. Maybe it's art, maybe it's not, form that's on our playground. But we are definitely planning on doing some work with cob and drawing on those experiences. Cob is a very old building material. Most people are familiar with adobe. Cob is adobe, but it's what you call it when you don't form it into bricks before you build with it, that you build freeform with the clay and dirt and water, and you need a tensile element, which in
straw?
Straw, exactly. Traditional cultures, it was manure, but straw to hold it together. There are buildings in Yemen that have been standing for 1,000 years, built out of it, this stuff. And it's a wonderful thing. That's what those sculptures on the mall in front of the Native American Museum were created from. And we have actually a couple of playhouses on our playground that our community, parents, teachers, and children made together. Well, we're now at a moment where children, one, are noticing and interested in those structures. They, as you might expect, they're about a little bit more than 10 years old now, maybe 12 years old. They have some places that have holes and cracks and marks, and so we're going to be doing some repair work, but also in using that material to do some sculptures and different kinds of things with it and experiences with mud and sand. So that's our next direction, I think.
Okay.
And I think that just as the art is continuing, it also describes how science inquiry happens in early childhood, that children don't just explore the properties of water once. Okay, we're going to make drops, we're going to play in a water table, at the sensory table, we'll pour it down a tube, and then we'll get cloth wet and watch it dry, and then we're done with exploring water. That isn't what happens. In early childhood, we really encourage people to let children explore materials over and over again, and then as they're discussing it and thinking about new ways to try using the materials and exploring the phenomena of evaporation or of flow, then over time the children get a deeper understanding.
Because they're building those experiences.
That's right.
That makes a lot of... I also like that it's, we can focus so often on we're learning this science because it's going to build this or make this or it's going to have a function. And there's that whole other human side of we're doing this for the process, for the love of it, for the, you know, for just being involved with, in this case, nature or the materials or things like that. It doesn't have to have a function.
It's fascinating to see what
or
children
art
do.
is the function.
Yeah.
You know, I think both, I mean, thinking again about connections between art and science, you know, when a scientist stumbles onto a really compelling, interesting question or idea, or an artist, you know, likewise has that inspiration, it isn't usually coming out of a purpose-driven moment, right? Like, it isn't because they sat down and said, okay, I'm going to do some science right now.
Today
and
I'm going to make a hypothesis.
Right. It's usually the most powerful things and the most revolutionary thinking, right? But the things that are driving us forward in science and technology, as well as you know, the most incredible art, they're from those moments where the scientist or the artist is, you know, deeply engaged in exploring, experimenting, playing with materials, with ideas, watching, observing, you know, all of those things coming together in the creative process and the scientific process. So that's, you know, that is super important, I think, is allowing children to develop that ability to watch, to observe, to play, to manipulate, to reflect, and to have inspiration strike, or to form that really important question coming from their observation about what's happening around them. You know, and that's not a process you can short circuit, get to the end too quickly.
Yeah, true. Is there anything, I think this is a good place to stop, but is there anything that you would like to still share with the listeners before we finish up?
Well, I certainly saw a lot of that experimenting, messing about, exploring, and creativity when I was working with the children and the teachers at the Clarendon Childcare Center. I just was very delighted to see them asking questions and looking for answers.
And that's really the goal, I think, that we'd want any of our students to do in any science setting. So congratulations if we can do it with 2-year-olds, and I was going to say second-year-olds, 2-year-olds. We should be able to do it with anyone, right?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to one, do this project and write it up, and so it could catch our eyes in NSTA, and taking the time to talk to us today.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for the wonderful conversation.
If you'd like to learn more about today's episode, head on over to our website, laboutloud.com, for more information. You can also find details about all the previous episodes, and you can leave us feedback and comments. We want to hear from you.
If you enjoyed the show, make sure you've subscribed on iTunes, Google Play Music, or your favorite podcasting platform. And if you really enjoyed it, consider leaving us a rating or a review. Your feedback helps others find our show.
If you like Lab Out Loud and you love the show that we provide for you, please consider supporting the show at our Patreon page. Head on over to patreon.com/laboutloud for more information. Until next time, I'm Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.